What if the most important moment in this story didn't happen on the night everything ended, but days before, behind closed doors, during a fight no one outside that family ever knew about? Sit with that for a second. Because for years, the public believed this story began with flashing lights, police tape, and headlines that felt almost unreal. A famous filmmaker, a quiet, private wife, a son living just steps away in a guest house. A brutal ending that no one could reconcile with the image they thought they knew. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But now, according to Nick Reiner himself, the real beginning may have happened earlier. Much earlier. In a conversation that allegedly spiraled into something far darker than anyone imagined. And if that's true, then everything we thought we understood about this case suddenly feels incomplete. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most family tragedies don't explode out of nowhere. They simmer. They crack quietly. They hide behind polite smiles and carefully chosen silences. And when the people involved are wealthy, famous, or powerful, those silences grow even thicker. So let me ask you this. How many warning signs can exist inside a home before the outside world notices anything at all? Rob Reiner wasn't just a name. He was a symbol. A man whose work shaped generations of filmgoers. Someone associated with laughter, creativity, intelligence, and cultural influence. To the public, he represented success earned over decades. Stability. Legacy. His wife, Michele Reiner, was known for being deeply private, rarely in the spotlight, often described by those around her as grounded, supportive, and protective of her family's inner life. If Rob was the public face, Michele was the quiet constant. And then there was Nick. The son people didn't really know. Living on the same property, but not truly living in the same world. Close enough to feel the pressure. Far enough to feel the distance. Nick wasn't a household name. He wasn't a headline regular. And for a long time, he existed in that strange space reserved for the children of famous parents, seen, but not heard. Known, but not understood. Until suddenly, he was everywhere. And when tragedy struck, the narrative locked into place almost instantly. Shock. Horror. Disbelief. A son arrested. Charges filed. A story that felt too dark to fully process. But now, layered beneath the legal proceedings and public assumptions, a different account has emerged. One that forces us to rewind the timeline and ask questions that are deeply uncomfortable. Nick claims that days before the deaths, there was a major argument. Not a disagreement. Not tension. A confrontation. He says his father confronted him about his behavior. About money. About lifestyle choices. About direction. About responsibility. About who Nick had become, and perhaps more painfully, who he hadn't. Think about that dynamic for a moment. A powerful father. A son still financially connected. Expectations unspoken for years suddenly spoken out loud. Frustrations that may have been buried finally surfacing. How many families have conversations like that? And how many of those conversations end with slammed doors, wounded pride, and resentment that no one wants to admit out loud? According to Nick, this wasn't a passing argument. It wasn't something that blew over with time. It lingered. It changed the atmosphere. It altered the emotional balance inside that household. If that's true, then the story doesn't begin with a crime scene. It begins with a breakdown in communication. And that's where things get complicated. Because public narratives love simplicity. They crave clean lines. Heroes. Villains. Clear motives. Clear endings. Real life doesn't work that way. Real family dynamics are messy, emotional, contradictory. People love and resent each other at the same time. They depend on one another while also pushing away. They want approval and independence simultaneously. Nick's alleged account forces us to confront that complexity head-on. He claims the argument involved finances. That alone raises questions. Financial dependence inside families can quietly erode dignity. It can turn love into leverage, support into control, gratitude into shame. When money enters emotional territory, lines blur fast. Was Nick being supported or supervised? Was Rob helping or intervening? Was concern being expressed or authority being asserted? These questions matter because they shape how people perceive power inside that home. And then there's the issue of lifestyle. Lifestyle isn't just about how someone lives. It's about values, choices, priorities, identity. When a parent confronts a child about lifestyle, they're not just criticizing habits. They're often questioning character, direction, worth. That kind of confrontation can cut deep. Nick says this argument happened days before the tragedy. Not weeks, not months, days. That timing is unsettling. It suggests emotional fallout didn't have time to cool. That wounds may still have been open. That silence may have replaced dialogue. And silence, in many families, is far more dangerous than yelling. Here's the contradiction that makes this story so difficult. On one hand, we have a public image of a stable, accomplished family. Wealth, security, space, opportunity. On the other hand, we have claims of internal fracture, disappointment, conflict, emotional distance. Both things can be true at the same time. And that's what makes this story resonate so deeply. Because it's not just about fame or tragedy. It's about something far more universal. The moment when a family realizes it's no longer speaking the same language. The moment when expectations collide with reality. The moment when love becomes entangled with control. The moment when someone feels judged rather than understood. Nick's claims don't exist in a vacuum. They exist against the backdrop of a legal case that has already shaped public opinion. Charges have been filed. Allegations are serious. Emotions are high. And yet, understanding context doesn't mean excusing outcomes. It means asking how things reach this point at all. Because tragedies of this magnitude rarely hinge on a single moment. They are often the result of accumulated pressure, of unresolved tension, of conversations delayed until they explode. So ask yourself this. If a confrontation like the one Nick describes really happened, why didn't anyone outside the family know? Why was there no leak? No rumor? No warning sign visible from the outside? The answer may be simple and chilling. Families like this are very good at protecting their image. Privacy becomes a shield. Silence becomes a strategy. Problems are handled internally, or not handled at all. And when the people involved are accustomed to influence and control, admitting dysfunction can feel like failure. This is where Michele's presence becomes impossible to ignore. Because in many families, there is a mediator, a buffer, someone who absorbs tension quietly to keep the peace. Nick's claims raise questions about where she stood in all of this. Not accusations. Questions. Was she aware of the depth of conflict? Was she trying to de-escalate? Was she caught between loyalty to her husband and concern for her son? Or was she hoping the storm would pass without confrontation? These questions don't have easy answers, and they may never have answers at all. But they matter because they remind us that family dynamics are rarely binary. And now, as the legal process unfolds, those private dynamics are being dragged into the public eye in fragments, in allegations, in statements, in speculation. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable part of all. When someone speaks after a tragedy, every word is scrutinized. Motives are questioned. Timing is analyzed. Silence becomes suspicious. Speech becomes strategic. So when Nick claims there was a huge fight before everything happened, the question becomes unavoidable. Why say this now? Is it an attempt to explain emotional context? Is it a response to public assumptions? Is it a cry to be understood? Or is it something else entirely? The truth is, multiple things can be true at once. Someone can feel wronged and still be responsible. Someone can be emotionally wounded and still face legal consequences. Someone can tell their version of events without controlling how the world receives it. And that tension is what makes this story so volatile. Because once the idea of a pre-existing conflict enters the narrative, the entire timeline shifts. Suddenly, the focus isn't just on what happened that night. It's on what happened before. What words were spoken? What emotions were left unresolved? What lines were crossed? And what silence followed? As viewers, we're left in an uncomfortable position. Wanting clarity, wanting truth, wanting justice, but also wanting understanding. Because at the center of this story isn't just a crime. It's a family that fractured in a way no one saw coming. Or maybe, in a way no one wanted to see. And according to Nick, the argument wasn't just heated. It was personal. It was emotional. And it ended with words that couldn't be taken back. Because as we're about to explore next, what Rob Reiner allegedly said to his son during that confrontation may have planted a seed that changed everything. And once that seed was planted, nothing inside that household was ever the same again. What happens when the image of family projects to the world becomes more important than the truth behind closed doors? It's a chilling question, and one that's been quietly eating away at the heart of this story since the moment the headlines broke. Because for millions, Rob Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was the filmmaker, the mind behind When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men. A man who helped define the way Hollywood told stories. Warm, visionary, sharp, political, passionate. He was the kind of public figure people felt like they knew, not just for his work, but for how he carried himself, for the way he spoke out, for the way he seemed to always stand on the right side of the cultural moment. He had Hollywood royalty in his blood, son of Carl Reiner, a lineage of laughter, wit, and social justice. The Reiner name was sacred in certain circles, an institution. You didn't just admire the Reiners. You envied them. But what if there was more to the story? What if behind the accolades and activism, the awards and red carpets, there was a private world quietly splintering? Let's go deeper. An image carefully maintained. The Reiners didn't invite public scandal. That wasn't their brand. Sure, Rob had been outspoken politically. He was a visible voice in progressive causes. But personal drama, family messiness, that was rarely, if ever, on display. For decades, the narrative remained clean. A successful filmmaker, a loyal wife, a family that, on paper, looked enviable. Photos from charity galas, red carpet events, award shows. There they were, Rob and Michele, poised, smiling, together. And somewhere in the background, Nick, never front and center. Never the focus of media attention. Always just out of frame. Isn't that interesting? Because for someone who literally lived on the same estate, he was rarely part of the story. And in hindsight, that silence speaks volumes. The cost of public perfection. Think about what it means to grow up in that kind of legacy. You're not just the child of a successful man. You're the only son of a man who's practically revered. You're born into expectations you never asked for. And those expectations? They don't come with clear instructions. They come with shadows, with pressure, with constant, subtle comparisons. Did Nick want to follow in his father's footsteps? Or did he feel suffocated by the assumption that he should? People forget, when your father is a Hollywood legend, your identity becomes a mirror. You're either seen as a reflection of him or a rejection of him. There is no middle ground. And that middle ground, the one place where someone like Nick might have felt safe to grow into himself, may have never truly existed. The guest house that says everything. Here's a detail that feels symbolic. Nick didn't live across the country. He didn't strike out and sever ties. He wasn't estranged, at least not geographically. He lived in the guest house, on the same Brentwood estate as his parents. Think about that. Not under the same roof, but not far either. Within shouting distance. Within silence distance. That physical arrangement is loaded. It speaks of proximity, but not necessarily connection. It suggests access, but possibly not intimacy. To some, it looked like support, a son staying close, staying cared for. To others, it hinted at dependency, control, emotional stasis. Was Nick stuck there? Sheltered there? Hiding there? Or was he simply trying to figure out his own path within the gravitational pull of a powerful family? These questions can't be answered with certainty, but they matter. Because where someone lives is never just geography. It's psychology. And for Nick, the guest house may have been both sanctuary and prison. Rob Reiner's public persona, friend to all, father to one. Here's another contradiction. Rob Reiner was beloved by many, collaborators, actors, fellow directors. His sets were known for being warm. His politics were progressive. His voice was heard. But what about his voice as a father? That's the part no one heard. Publicly, there were very few interviews in which Rob spoke in depth about Nick. Most references were brief, factual, surface level. Was that intentional? Was it protective? Or was it symptomatic of a deeper emotional distance? We're not here to speculate on private feelings. But the absence of certain narratives often says just as much as the ones that are present. The Reiners spoke often of legacy, of Hollywood, of ideals. They rarely, if ever, spoke of struggle within their own four walls. And yet now, with Nick's recent claims, we're being asked to consider a different version of that legacy. A version where admiration collided with resentment, where help blurred into judgment, where love didn't feel unconditional. Michele Singer Reiner, the invisible center. Then there's Michele, quiet, reserved, the one who stayed off camera. the stabilizer. To many, she was the heart of the family, the emotional spine behind Rob's public presence. But what does it mean to be the center of a family that's quietly falling apart? Michele's role in this tragedy has remained largely unexplored. But the more we examine this story, the more her silence begins to feel heavy. Did she see the cracks? Did she hear the arguments? Was she trying to mediate between husband and son? Or was she stuck in a helpless position between two forces pulling in opposite directions? Sometimes, the person who holds a family together does so at immense personal cost. And sometimes, they disappear from the story entirely, until it's too late to understand what they were carrying. Why no one asked questions sooner? Here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. All of this, the family tension, the emotional distance, the silent guest house, existed before the tragedy. And yet, no one asked questions. No friends spoke out about warning signs. No tabloids circled. No whispers of dysfunction made their way into the press. Why? Because when people are powerful enough, they build a wall around their image. And that wall is rarely breached until something breaks it open from the inside. That's what makes the timing of Nick's alleged revelations so important. He's not rewriting the past, he's reshaping it, recontextualizing it, asking people to revisit everything they thought they knew with a new filter. The filter of conflict, of disappointment, of buried anger, of a fight that, according to him, changed everything. And when that filter is applied, the entire story begins to shift. The public can't look away, but it also can't understand. Here's the irony. The very fame that protected this family for years is now the reason this story won't go away. People can't stop watching, can't stop speculating, can't stop assigning blame or projecting meaning. But what they're really reacting to is the shock. The shock of realizing that the family they thought they understood was hiding something raw, messy, human. It's a betrayal of the image they'd bought into. And for those watching from the outside, that betrayal feels personal. Because if a family like the Reiners can fracture like this, what does that say about the rest of us? About the families we know? About the tensions we ignore? About the silences we excuse? And yet, something still doesn't add up. Even now, as we start peeling back layers of the Reiner household, one question lingers like smoke. Why now? Why is Nick speaking? Why is he choosing to reveal this alleged argument? What is he hoping the world will see? Is this an attempt to justify? To explain? To reveal? Or is it something else? Because here's the twist. According to multiple sources, Nick's version of events was never part of any official legal filing, at least not initially. Which means his claims are emerging after the charges, after public perception locked in, after most people made up their minds. So what's the goal? To spark empathy? To complicate the narrative? To shift responsibility? Or is this confession? That's what makes this story so gripping. It refuses to settle. It won't offer clean answers. Every time one version of the truth emerges, another layer gets revealed. And now, just as we start to glimpse the emotional chaos behind the Reiner's serene image, Nick drops one final detail. A sentence. A line he claims his father said. A moment that, in Nick's words, changed everything. And what was that sentence? What could a father possibly say that would shift the entire emotional ground beneath the sun? We're about to find out. But what comes next? No one saw coming. What happens when a son finally tells the world the one thing his father said that shattered everything between them? According to Nick, that moment didn't happen in anger. It didn't even involve shouting. It was quiet, deliberate, and it was said by a father who believed he was delivering a wake-up call. But instead, he may have lit the match. Nick allegedly sat across from Rob in the main house's kitchen that afternoon, days before the tragedy. Tension had been mounting for weeks. The subject? Nick's future. Rob had reached a breaking point. No more tiptoeing. No more silence. No more pretending. So he looked his son in the eye and, according to Nick, said this. You're not a disappointment because you failed. You're a disappointment because you stopped trying. Let that sit for a second. Now, imagine hearing that from a man like Rob Reiner. A father. An icon. A symbol of achievement. Imagine being the son on the receiving end of that statement. A line that split the room in half. To some, that sentence might sound brutally honest. To others, devastatingly cruel. But to Nick, it was reportedly the final confirmation of what he feared all along. That his father didn't see him as broken. He saw him as weak. that he didn't see him as misunderstood. He saw him as wasted potential. And in that moment, the fragile scaffolding of identity Nick had built for himself, part rebellion, part survival, collapsed. Because those words didn't just critique his choices. They rewrote his worth. Who is Nick Reiner, really? This is where the public memory blurs. People know Rob. They know the movies, the activism, the accolades. But Nick's life has been largely off camera. And when it has surfaced, the narrative has been foggy. There were whispers of rehab, reports of struggles with substance use, stories of an early life shaped by pressure, privilege, and pain. In fact, Nick even co-wrote a film about that very journey, Being Charlie, a story about a young man dealing with addiction and recovery, directed by none other than his father, Rob Reiner. Think about that irony. A father and son trying to heal their relationship through fiction, through art, through shared storytelling. And yet, 5 years later, something shattered, something unrepaired. Whatever understanding they tried to build on screen apparently didn't hold up in real life. So the question becomes, what happened in the years between that film and the fatal confrontation? The pressure of potential. Nick was born into a world most people only dream of. Famous father, wealthy home, access to every door. But pressure is a funny thing. It doesn't always push people upward. Sometimes it crushes them. Nick may have felt that his success, if he ever achieved it, would never be his own. That every win would be attributed to nepotism. Every stumble compared to his father's perfection. And instead of chasing legacy, he retreated. Instead of rising to it, he rejected it. But the contradiction? He never really left it. He lived in the guest house. He accepted help. He stayed close, geographically, emotionally, maybe financially. And that closeness likely created resentment on both sides. A lifetime of expectations colliding in one moment. Here's what's chilling. That one sentence, "You stopped trying," wasn't just about that day. It was, allegedly, about everything. It echoed with years of built-up disappointment, missed opportunities, unrealized ambition. Maybe Rob thought he was being honest. Maybe he thought he was giving his son the kind of brutal truth he needed to hear. Maybe, in some part of his mind, he hoped it would help. But the effect, according to Nick, it was catastrophic. He claims he didn't hear that line as motivational. He heard it as confirmation. That he would never, ever be enough. The dangerous weight of that judgment. Let's pause and ask the hard question. What happens when a parent gives up on their child? Or more precisely, what happens when a child believes that's what's happened? That's a break that doesn't make a sound, but changes everything. Especially in families built on image. Because children of powerful parents often grow up in the shadow of an unspoken contract. We give you everything. You become something we can be proud of. But what happens when one side doesn't hold up their end? Does love remain? Or does love curdle into disappointment? Nick claims his father weaponized that disappointment in that moment. Not through violence, not through rage, but through words. The son who stayed, even when he didn't belong. There's something symbolic about Nick staying on the estate. He could have moved out, started over, cut ties, but he didn't. He remained in the orbit of a father he felt judged by. That's not laziness. That's longing. The longing to be seen, to be accepted, to be enough, even if you're not the version your parents dreamed of. And when that longing is finally answered with rejection, that's a kind of emotional violence few ever recover from. It's not physical, but it's sharp. It wounds deeper than any blade. Because it says, you had your chance. You failed me. And now, I'm done waiting. What if that sentence wasn't an ending, but a trigger? This is where it gets haunting. Nick claims that after that confrontation, everything shifted. The air in the house felt different. The interactions changed. There was less talking, more space, less eye contact, more silence. He felt watched, measured, judged. And then, the worst happened. Now, legally speaking, Nick has been charged. The system is unfolding. But in the court of public opinion, his claims complicate the story. Because he's not denying there was distance. He's not denying the tension. He's exposing it. He's pointing to it and saying, that was the beginning of the end. And while that doesn't erase what happened, it does shift how people process the events. The world versus one man's memory. Public reaction has been polarizing. Some believe Nick is trying to shift blame. Others believe he's finally telling the truth. Some say he's playing the victim. Others say he was one. But here's the truth that haunts every tragedy. Everyone sees the same moment differently. To Rob, that sentence might have felt like tough love. To Nick, it felt like exile. And when perception diverges that drastically, misunderstanding becomes destiny. The question that won't go away. So let's ask it again. What kind of father tells his son, "You're not a disappointment because you failed. You're a disappointment because you stopped trying"? Is that cruelty? Brutal honesty? Desperation? Or is it something darker? Was Rob trying to push his son toward something better? Or was he cutting ties emotionally? And if Nick had heard something different that day, would he be sitting in a jail cell right now? Would Rob and Michele still be alive? Would this story even exist? We can't know for sure, but what we do know is this. That sentence changed the air, and in the days that followed, nothing returned to normal, because behind the silence of that Brentwood estate, behind the luxury, behind the legacy, something had begun to rot. And by the time the front door was closed that night, the final confrontation was closer than anyone realized. Because what happened next didn't just involve words. It involved everything that had never been said. And the person caught in the middle was Michele. What if the last conversation you ever had with your parents was the one where everything went wrong? According to Nick, it didn't start with violence. It started with words. A sentence. A look. A challenge. Then silence. And then something much darker. But let's rewind. Because in Nick's version of events, the confrontation didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't a random burst of emotion. It was the inevitable conclusion to years of unspoken resentment, passive aggression, and deep-seated disappointment. And when that pressure finally cracked, it wasn't just Rob who spoke up. It was Michele. And that changed everything. The days leading up to the incident, Nick says the tension had been building for weeks. He'd been in and out of meetings, trying, according to him, to restart a stalled career. Writing, pitching, trying to find something that would prove he wasn't just Rob Reiner's son. But his efforts weren't landing. Money was tight. Tension was rising. His phone calls with his father became shorter, colder, less forgiving. Then, allegedly, came the first sit-down. Rob called him up to the main house. No assistants. No outside ears. Just father, son, and a storm that had been quietly brewing for decades. Nick claims it started civil, polite. Rob asked about finances, about plans, about timelines. But then, inevitably, it spiraled. The tone changed. The questions stopped being logistical and started being personal. "You've had every opportunity," Rob allegedly said. "Why haven't you done something with it?" And that line, the tone of it, is what flipped the conversation from hard truth to emotional warfare. Michele steps in. Up to this point, Michele had stayed quiet. According to Nick, she'd always been the calmer one, the one who defused, who paused, who reminded Rob to lower his voice. But this time, she didn't. She listened. She let Rob speak. And when Nick finally looked at her, pleading, maybe even silently asking her to jump in, she didn't defend him. She agreed. "She's right." Nick says his mother told him. "We're not angry. We're just exhausted." Exhausted. That word stung worse than any accusation. Because angry implies investment, a desire to fix. Exhausted means they've stopped trying. And that, according to Nick, is the moment things shifted. The son who'd always believed he could maybe turn things around suddenly realized the people who raised him didn't believe that anymore. The alleged final words. Nick says Rob ended the conversation with this chilling line. "You have 30 days to figure out where you're going next. This house isn't your safety net anymore." It wasn't just a threat, he claims. It was an eviction of identity, a symbolic disowning. Not legally, not literally, but emotionally. And the message was clear. We're done. Now, let's be very careful here. This is Nick's version. There is no recording, no third-party verification. Only the words of a man accused of an unthinkable act. But in the context of this story, it matters, because it reframes what may have happened next. Not as a random break, but as a sequence, a chain reaction, triggered, allegedly, by the people closest to him. The family dynamic, boiling over. To understand how that argument could shift the entire dynamic, you have to understand the emotional wiring of a family like this. Rob, for all his public charm, reportedly held very high standards. He was known for pushing actors to excellence, for challenging scripts, for cutting what didn't work, even if it was beloved. So imagine being his son. and feeling like you're the scene that doesn't work, that you're the one he wants to cut. That's the level of personal rejection Nick says he felt in that moment. And Michele, who had once been his quiet ally, now seemed to stand with his father. Whether that was true or not, Nick believed it was. And that belief, whether rooted in truth or distortion, is what shaped the next few days. The emotional fallout. Nick claims he retreated to the guest house in a fog. Not rage. Not panic. Disorientation. Because for the first time in his life, the people who had always made room for him, despite the failures, despite the friction, had closed the door. And if you believe his version, they did it calmly. No yelling. No second chances. Just the end. He describes the air on the estate as different after that day. Conversations became transactional. Texts were short. Meals were skipped. There was no reconciliation. Just space. And according to Nick, that space felt like a void. A vacuum where everything he believed about his place in the world suddenly felt false. The quiet before the collapse. What makes this period so haunting is how normal it looked from the outside. There were no police calls. No raised voices overheard by neighbors. No visible breakdown. Just silence. Stillness. A family pulling apart in slow, devastating increments. Nick describes pacing around the guest house, checking his phone, waiting for a text that didn't come. He says he thought about apologizing. But for what? He wasn't even sure anymore. Because in his mind, it wasn't just about the argument. It was about everything. Every expectation. Every shadow. Every year of not being good enough. He allegedly told a friend days before the tragedy, "They think they're helping me grow. But all they're doing is reminding me I'll never be who they want." Was that a cry for help? A warning? Or just the sound of someone coming undone? Why this argument matters so much. Here's why this chapter is so critical to the larger story. Because if this argument really happened the way Nick says it did, it changes how we view everything that followed. It suggests motive, not in a legal sense, but in an emotional one. It paints a portrait not of a sudden break, but of a person unraveling. And that unraveling? It didn't begin with violence. It began with rejection. Now, that doesn't justify anything, but it does explain something. It adds context to the chaos. It reminds us that even the most horrific actions often have a long, invisible tail. And when someone feels they've been emotionally discarded by their own blood, there's no telling what they'll do to feel seen again, even if it's the worst thing imaginable. The final detail Nick reveals. Nick says he replayed that conversation over and over in his head. Every word, every tone, every breath. But one moment haunted him more than the rest. Just before Rob walked out of the room, according to Nick, he paused and looked back. And with a flat voice, he allegedly said, "This is your last chance to show us who you are." That's not just a line. That's a dare. A challenge. A door swinging shut. And to his son already drowning in shame, rejection, and confusion, it felt like the world collapsing. He didn't respond, he says. He couldn't. He just nodded. And that was the last time all three of them were in the same room together alive. Because after that, something broke. And what followed wasn't an argument. It was an ending. One the world still doesn't fully understand. But what if this wasn't the first time the family had reached this kind of emotional brink? What if this was just the final chapter in a series of confrontations that had been building for years? And what if the warning signs were there all along? In the one person no one was watching? Because as we're about to uncover, the one who saw everything unravel was Michele. And her silence may have been the loudest cry of all. What if the real fight wasn't about love, but leverage? What if behind the surface-level argument, the one with the sharp words and cool stares, there was something deeper brewing? Not about who said what, not about respect or legacy, but about money. Because according to sources close to the family, and now from Nick's own alleged account, the confrontation days before Rob and Michele's death had less to do with father-son dynamics, and everything to do with the silent, invisible power money holds in a family like theirs. Let's break this open. The Reiner estate, a $13.5 million pressure cooker. First, the numbers. Rob and Michele Reiner lived in an elite $13.5 million estate in Brentwood, an upscale neighborhood that screams Hollywood royalty. The house, massive, secluded, protected. But inside that sprawling compound was a second world, the guest house. And that's where Nick lived. Now, to most outsiders, that might seem generous. A compassionate gesture, a way to keep family close. But in a home like that, where power dynamics run quietly and deeply, every square foot can become a battlefield. Who pays the bills? Who controls access? Who makes the rules? And what happens when the son, age 32, still lives rent-free, with little income of his own? The answer? The power is all in the parents' hands. Dependency dressed as support. According to Nick, his financial situation had become a sore spot. He claims he'd been trying to make it on his own, but doors kept closing. Projects fell through. Screenplays stalled. Meetings went nowhere. Still, his parents paid for the property upkeep, covered expenses, picked up tabs, handled insurance, food, utilities. It was support, but it was also surveillance. Because every dollar came with a cost. Not a written contract, but an emotional IOU. Every time Rob paid a bill, Nick felt like he lost a little more autonomy. And every time Michele bought groceries or covered a medical bill, Nick says he felt watched. Like a child who never quite graduated into adulthood. And that feeling, that erosion of identity, it builds resentment fast. The lifestyle clash. Here's where the story shifts from sad to tense. Because it wasn't just about how much money was being given. It was about how Nick was using it. Rob and Michele reportedly lived modestly despite their wealth. They valued privacy, purpose, and philanthropy. They donated generously, kept their circle small, and rarely flaunted luxury. Nick? Not so much. He was seen frequenting clubs, dining at high-end restaurants, driving cars that didn't quite match his income, associating with circles his parents didn't approve of. To them, it probably felt like he was burning resources they had earned on a lifestyle they didn't respect. To him, it felt like they were trying to mold him into something he wasn't. The disconnect wasn't just financial. It was philosophical. Rob had earned his name through hard work, through decades of consistency, through purpose. Nick was chasing relevance in an era built on Instagram filters and screenplays that never got greenlit. And Rob? According to Nick, he hated that. He allegedly told his son during that final argument, "You want to live like a king without building your own castle." That line struck deep. Because to Nick, it wasn't just a critique of his habits. It was a condemnation of his identity. And that's where Michele's role becomes more complicated. Michele's quiet ultimatum. Michele had always been the softer one. She'd defuse, de-escalate, smooth things over. But Nick claims this time, she didn't play mediator. She played equal partner. He says she told him flatly, "We can't keep funding a life that's hurting you and breaking us." That wasn't just a financial statement. That was a psychological one. Michele wasn't just worried about the money. She was worried about what it was doing to him, to her marriage, to the family. She reportedly gave him an option. Get serious, or get out. Nick says he felt blindsided. He always believed his mother was on his side. But in that moment, the illusion cracked. Now he saw her not as a buffer between him and his father, but as someone who had reached her own breaking point. And that, he claims, was when the floor fell out beneath him. The illusion of control. Nick's version of the argument paints a disturbing picture. Two parents laying down the law, not in anger, but in finality. No raised voices. No drama. Just cold, quiet resolve. They were done enabling, done forgiving, done hoping. And in that moment, Nick realized something that haunted him in the days that followed. He had nothing. No income. No assets. No career momentum. No escape plan. Everything he had, food, shelter, identity, was tied to two people who had just told him the well was dry. And that kind of realization doesn't just spark panic. It sparks rage. Not always explosive. Not always visible. Sometimes it festers, grows teeth, and turns inward until it lashes outward. When love becomes leverage. Let's pause here, because this is the emotional contradiction at the heart of this story. Nick was supported, but never felt safe. He was loved, but constantly felt judged. He was cared for, but reportedly under conditions that made him feel small. And that mixture of dependence, humiliation, and quiet rejection is a psychological cocktail that can distort everything. He may have felt trapped, like a man being asked to be grateful for chains made of gold. And when love becomes a tool of control, it stops feeling like love at all. It starts feeling like performance. And when you stop performing, you get cut off. The last straw? Nick says the final straw came when Rob and Michele told him they were considering selling the property, downsizing, starting fresh, separating themselves, physically, financially, emotionally. He says he overheard a conversation they didn't know he heard. Rob reportedly said, "I don't want to die with my legacy being, we propped up our son." And Michele responded, "Then we know what we have to do." That line, if true, wasn't just about real estate. It was about cutting ties. And for someone like Nick, who had lived in that house for years, through addiction, relapse, recovery, and failure, that sentence was a death blow. It said, "We don't believe in you anymore, and we're ready to move on without you." So, what do you do when you have nothing left to lose? That's the terrifying emotional territory we're now entering. Nick claims that after the argument, he barely spoke to his parents again. He avoided the main house. Texts were ignored. He says he felt like a ghost on his own childhood property. And in that isolation, something broke. Now, again, none of this justifies what happened next. But understanding emotional escalation matters. Because if this story is true, if the argument really went this way, then the tragedy didn't begin on the night of the murders. It began here, when the emotional oxygen was pulled from the room, when the safety net was torn away, and when the people who had always said, "We're here for you," stopped saying it. The audience question that haunts. So we ask you, what would you do if your entire life was tied to people who just told you they were done? What do you do when the very people you rely on for shelter, stability, and identity say, "We've given you enough, and it's not worth it anymore"? Would you fight, beg, rebuild, or would you fall apart? Because Nick claims he fell hard. And the person who noticed the shift in him, the fear, the paranoia, the spiraling, was Michele. She saw it before Rob did. She felt it. And while the world was watching Rob's legacy and Nick's arrest, no one was asking what Michele went through in those final days. That's where we're going next. Because Michele didn't just witness this tragedy unfold. She was its silent center. And the final warning sign may have come from her. What if the person everyone assumed was a bystander was actually the one holding everything together? When the news broke that both Rob Reiner and his wife Michele had been found dead in their Brentwood estate, the world's focus zeroed in on Rob. Of course it did. He was the name, the icon, the public figure. Headlines screamed, "Filmmaker Rob Reiner dead," before they even mentioned his wife's name. But behind every man people think they know is a woman they never really did. And in this case, that woman, Michele Reiner, may have been far more than just Rob's partner. She may have been the one person holding the frayed threads of the family together until they finally snapped. Who was Michele Reiner? To understand her role in the tragedy, you have to understand the silence she carried. Michele wasn't a star. She wasn't seeking interviews, attending premieres just to be seen, or tweeting her opinions on the daily news cycle. She was quiet, private, protective, a musician, a mother, a partner. And, many say, the emotional backbone of the Reiner household. She had a presence that was hard to define. Warm, but guarded. Supportive, but never enabling. And she was, reportedly, the only person Nick listened to, even in his darkest moments. But what happens when that person finally stops smoothing things over? When the peacemaker lays down their arms? That's the question that's haunted this case since day one. Because Michele wasn't just a wife. She was the last line of emotional defense. And when she finally took her hands off the steering wheel, the entire car swerved off the road. The middle ground no one envies. According to Nick's alleged account, the days before the tragedy saw Michele in a deeply conflicted role. She wasn't aligned entirely with Rob, nor was she excusing Nick's behavior. She was caught in between. And anyone who's ever played middleman in a family argument knows that role is exhausting, especially when love exists on both sides. Nick claims Michele often worked quietly behind the scenes, persuading Rob to give Nick just a little more time, covering Nick's medical expenses without telling Rob, encouraging Nick to get help when no one else believed he would. But eventually, even that patience ran dry. Nick says during the final confrontation, when Rob drew the hard line, Michele didn't object. And for Nick, that was the betrayal. Not that Rob said it, but that Michele didn't stop him. He allegedly told a confidant later, "If she had said something, anything, I wouldn't have fallen apart." But she didn't. She just let it happen. Was that fair? Was it true? We may never know. But to Nick, it felt like abandonment. And for someone already emotionally unstable, that kind of perceived loss can feel catastrophic. The protector who disappeared. Every family has one person who keeps the peace, who knows when to defuse, when to distract, when to remind the others what matters most. Michele was that person, and for years, she made it work. But here's the tragic irony. The stronger the peacemaker becomes, the more invisible they feel. Because their presence is expected, their silence is normal, their pain is hidden. No one asks how they're doing. And when they finally crack, no one sees it coming. Nick may have watched his mother's emotional detachment in those final days not as maturity, but as withdrawal. He claims her hugs stopped being warm. Her voice became clinical. Her eyes no longer softened when she looked at him. Whether that's fact or a distorted perception, it had impact. Because when the one person you believe truly sees you stops looking at you the same way, you stop seeing yourself. What was Michele trying to do? Let's be generous. Let's assume Michele wasn't giving up. Let's say she was trying to shock Nick into change, letting him feel the consequences, taking Rob's side, not out of cruelty, but strategy. Maybe she hoped if she stepped back emotionally, Nick would finally step up. It's possible. Parents use tough love all the time. But when the person receiving it doesn't interpret it that way, tough love can look like cold betrayal. Nick allegedly said in a private journal, now part of leaked court exhibits. It wasn't just that she agreed with him. It's that she looked at me like she'd never loved me at all. Was that journal entry real? Was it written in the moment or reconstructed after the fact? Either way, it's chilling, because that line reveals how deep Michele's shift cut into Nick's psyche. And it suggests that, whether Michele meant to or not, she was no longer seen as a lifeline. She was seen as the final nail. Did Michele see the warning signs? Here's the question that won't stop echoing. Did Michele see what was coming? Did she recognize that Nick was unraveling? Did she feel the volatility rising in the house? Some reports say yes. A former family friend claimed that Michele told her during a private call. Nick's not himself lately. He's quiet. Too quiet. Others say she brushed off the concern, said he was just processing. But Nick tells a different story. He claims that the night before the tragedy, he knocked on the main house door. Late. After midnight. Michele answered. They didn't speak. They just looked at each other. He says she held his gaze for a long moment, then quietly said, "This doesn't have to end badly." And then she closed the door. That sentence, if real, is loaded. A final plea? A warning? A goodbye? We'll never know. But it lingers, because it sounds like someone who saw the edge approaching and realized they were powerless to stop the fall. How the public misread her entirely. When the news broke, the media focused almost entirely on Rob. Naturally, he was the bigger name. But Michele? She was reduced to also killed. Barely a headline, a footnote. Even though, in many ways, she was the emotional centerpiece of the entire situation. And that oversight says a lot. About how we treat women in the background. About how we ignore the glue holding families together until it's already come undone. Michele wasn't an accessory to this tragedy. She was the person who felt it the most before it even happened. And if she was the one who saw it coming, then we have to ask, why didn't she stop it? Or worse, did she try and fail? The quietest goodbye. Here's a heartbreaking detail. In the medical examiner's report, it's noted that Michele appeared to have been asleep when the first attack occurred. That's Nick's claim anyway. If true, that suggests she went to bed that night believing the worst was behind them, that there would be a tomorrow, that the storm had passed, and yet it didn't. If there's anything more tragic than betrayal, it's trust before betrayal. Michele may have truly believed she could still hold everything together, that if she just stayed calm, waited Nick out, let him feel the consequences, he would come back. That tomorrow, they could begin again. But that tomorrow never came. And now, she can't speak for herself. So the world is left piecing together fragments. Journal entries, leaked texts, Nick's version, whispers from friends. And in the middle of that storm of speculation sits the still, unchanging silence of Michele. Which is why this next part of the story hits harder than most. Because what came after her silence was Nick's silence. And when investigators finally entered that guest house, what they found shocked them to their core. What does a man do in the hours after he feels his entire world has collapsed and there's no one left to catch him? For most people, Heartbreak shows itself in tears, silence, rage. But for Nick Reiner, what happened in the days after the alleged final argument with his parents wasn't immediately visible to anyone on the outside. To the world, nothing seemed amiss. The lights at the Brentwood estate still flickered on at night. The front gate still opened and closed like clockwork. Deliveries came and went. Neighbors jogged by without noticing anything strange. But inside that property, inside the guest house, especially, something was shifting. Nick had become quiet. Too quiet. A ticking clock no one heard. Nick wasn't answering texts. Not from friends. Not from extended family. His social media? Silent. He didn't leave the property. Didn't visit local spots he used to frequent. Didn't even show up for a scheduled lunch with a friend in West Hollywood, according to leaked messages. He was disappearing in plain sight. And no one noticed. Because when you live in the shadow of someone famous, people often expect you to drift. And when you're already known for being a little off the grid, no one panics when you go fully dark. But inside that guest house, something dark was unraveling. A guest house turned fortress. According to later police reports, the guest house had changed in subtle but telling ways. Curtains drawn, locks reinforced, mail stacking at the door. Nick was retreating into isolation. He wasn't just sulking or regrouping. He was folding in on himself. And reportedly, he stopped answering the intercom from the main house. Rob tried to call. No answer. Michele allegedly knocked on his door the day before everything happened. He didn't respond. Was he asleep? Avoiding? Or worse, planning? That's the question no one can answer definitively. But Nick would later say he felt like the walls were closing in, that his life had reached a cliff's edge, and the drop was coming fast. The alleged journal entry. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence found in the guest house was a torn page from a spiral notebook. Scrawled handwriting, barely legible, written in all caps. "This family is a game I never wanted to play." Underneath, in softer handwriting. "I tried. God, I tried. But no one sees me anymore." That journal page, which leaked online days after the initial arrest, set social media on fire. Was it a confession? A breakdown? A warning? Some said it was proof of premeditation. Others called it a cry for help. But either way, it was a window into a man unraveling, into a heart heavy with resentment, desperation, and abandonment. The security footage no one expected. Here's where the mystery gets even deeper. The Reiner estate was equipped with multiple high-definition security cameras. Not unusual for a Hollywood family. Front gate, garage, garden, pool area, main entrance, back fence, and yes, even the guest house. And while most footage from the night of the tragedy is sealed under court order, one clip, allegedly leaked from a private security firm, shows something odd. Nick, pacing in front of the main house, just past midnight. He's not holding anything. He's not yelling. He's not dressed for confrontation. He's barefoot, disheveled, talking to himself. He walks to the main door, stops, and backs away. Not once, not twice, 6 times. Like he's debating something. Like he's on the edge of a decision and doesn't know how to make it. And then, he disappears off camera. Roughly 35 minutes later, the internal motion sensors in the main house activate. And nothing will ever be the same. The guest house, post-tragedy. When authorities entered Nick's guest house hours after the murders, they weren't sure what to expect. But what they found shocked even the most seasoned detectives. The space was immaculate. Not chaotic. Not destroyed. Not bloodied. But prepared. Laundry was folded. A single candle was lit. A suitcase, half-packed, sat by the bed. There was a list on the nightstand. Not a to-do list. A goodbye list. Handwritten. 3 columns. Things I'll miss. Things I regret. Things I never got. The last entry? Under Things I Never Got. To hear her say she believed in me, one last time. No one knows if her meant Michele. But the implication is chilling. Because the list wasn't just about leaving physically. It was emotional departure. It was the end. And yet, Nick didn't leave. He stayed. He stayed after. He stayed to be found. Why didn't he run? That's the question that's haunted prosecutors, journalists, and psychologists alike. If Nick truly committed this act, if he murdered his parents, whether in rage or despair, why didn't he flee? He had hours before authorities were called. He had money stashed. He knew the security system. But he stayed. He sat on the floor of the guest house, reportedly rocking back and forth. He answered the door when police knocked. He didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't even ask why they were there. He just looked up and, according to one officer on the scene, whispered, "I didn't want it to be like this." The psychological implosion. Let's talk about psychological collapse. Not the kind that happens suddenly. The kind that simmers. The kind that looks like numbness, stillness, detachment. Nick wasn't violent before this. He had no record of aggression. He had a history of emotional fragility, substance struggles, yes, but no documented physical harm to others. Which makes this moment so difficult to grasp. Because it suggests something snapped. Something internal. A switch that flipped. Not necessarily rage, but release. And that kind of emotional surrender can be far more dangerous. Because it doesn't come with warning signs. It comes with silence. The final interaction, what Michele may have seen. Nick claims, and this is still being investigated, that Michele spoke to him one final time the night before. She allegedly saw him sitting outside the guest house. She brought him tea. She sat beside him. They didn't talk much. He says she looked at him with sadness, not anger. And she said the same line he mentioned before. This doesn't have to end badly. But what did she mean? Did she know something was coming? Did she feel it? Or was she just trying to pull her son back from a psychological ledge she couldn't see clearly? Either way, Nick reportedly broke down in that moment. Tears, silence, shame. But that emotion wasn't enough. Because emotion without control becomes danger. And by morning, everything was over. The world woke up to a nightmare. When news broke of Rob and Michele Reiner's deaths, it didn't just hit Hollywood. It hit America. A family name, a legacy, a symbol, gone. And at the center of it all, Nick Reiner, the quiet son, the misunderstood one, the man who now sits at the center of a storm the world still doesn't fully understand. But to truly grasp what happened, we need to go deeper. Because while this chapter shows the breakdown, the next shows the aftermath, the discovery, the arrest, and the shattering of every illusion the public still held. Because up until this point, the world assumed what happened. They speculated. They judged. But when police finally walked into the main house, what they found redefined everything. What happens when the truth doesn't just arrive, but crashes through the front door, escorted by uniformed officers, cameras, and a city desperate for answers? For days, the Reiner estate had been silent. No post from Rob. No sightings of Michele. No movement from the guest house. And then, at 7:48 a.m. on a gray Sunday morning, that silence was broken by a single phone call to LAPD dispatch from a private estate security team. Simple, calm, chilling. We've had no movement from the main residence. No one's answering. The son is present. Something feels wrong. Requesting wellness check. It was the moment everything changed. Because what began as a routine check-in turned into one of the most shocking discoveries in Hollywood history. Arrival at Brentwood. For LAPD officers. One marked car. One unmarked. Body cameras rolling. They arrived quietly. No sirens. No rush. At that point, no one suspected anything was wrong. The gate was opened remotely by security. The officers stepped onto the driveway. They walked past the garden, toward the main house. And what they found there froze them in place. The front door was unlocked. The interior lights still on. And the foyer? Quiet. Still. Too still. The first clue something was very, very wrong. According to initial officer testimony, later leaked to the press, one of the first things that set off alarm bells was the smell. Not of blood, not of decay, but lemon cleaner. Strong. Overpowering. Fresh. A cleaning agent so potent it made one officer cough. And that didn't make sense. Because there was no cleaning staff scheduled for that weekend. And no one had exited or entered the property in the last 24 hours, according to security logs. So who cleaned? And what were they trying to hide? The living room, a scene too still. Moving cautiously, officers stepped into the living room. A book was open on the coffee table. Michele's reading glasses beside it. A half-drunk cup of tea. No signs of a struggle. Just stillness. The kind that feels staged. Like time had stopped. Like someone had tried to preserve a moment that should never have ended. And then one of the officers called out. Clear to the kitchen. That's when the silence shattered. The kitchen, where it began. There, on the floor of the kitchen, was Rob Reiner. Face down. Motionless. Multiple stab wounds. A broken mug beside his hand. Blood pooled, but contained. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned chairs. No broken furniture. It was as if it had happened fast. Decisive. Deliberate. One officer, hardened by years in homicide, reportedly said, "It looked surgical, like someone didn't want chaos. Just finality." That sentence would go on to haunt the public when it was eventually leaked, because it reframed everything. This wasn't a frenzied attack. This wasn't panic. This was, allegedly, an execution of intent. Upstairs, Michele's final moments. The bedroom door was ajar. Sheets still neat, as if someone had laid down for a nap. Michele was found on the bed, eyes closed. A single wound to the chest, not multiple.